The wine glass shattered against Italian marble, red liquid spreading like blood across the white floor. But it wasn't the wine that would kill Celestina Flores that night. It was what her husband had stirred into her soup exactly 17 minutes earlier. March 15, 2024, 8:47 p.m. Celestial Heights Tower, Manila. Penthouse apartment on the 24th floor, where the city lights glittered below like fallen stars, indifferent to the tragedy unfolding above them. James Mitchell watched his wife stumble backward, her hand clutching the dining table for support, her face already draining of color. Married for exactly 3 years to the day. He'd planned this anniversary celebration for months. But to understand how a fairy tale turned into a death sentence, we need to go back to where it all began. Back to when Celestina Flores still believed in escape routes from poverty, before she learned that some cages are lined with gold, and some princes are monsters in expensive suits. 3 years ago, she thought she'd won the lottery. Celestina Tina Flores stood 5 feet 3 inches tall, with long black hair that caught the light like polished obsidian and eyes that held too many secrets for 24 years. Those eyes had learned early to hide desperation behind carefully practiced smiles, to calculate survival in the split seconds between a customer's order and their departure, to measure the weight of every word before speaking it aloud. She was born in Barangay San Isidro, in the forgotten outskirts of Manila, where the gleaming skyscrapers visible from her childhood window might as well have existed on another planet. Her mother, Rosario, was a laundrywoman whose hands bled regularly from scrubbing the fine linens of families who never learned her name. Her father, Ernesto, drove a tricycle for 12 hours a day until a jeepney ran a red light when Tina was 12, turning him from provider to memory in the space of a heartbeat. After that, Tina became the second parent to 3 younger siblings. She finished high school through a scholarship program, her grades immaculate because failure meant returning to washing clothes beside her mother. Community college lasted 1 semester before the mathematics of poverty caught up with her. Tuition or food, education or electricity, dreams or survival, the choice made itself. At 21, she started working as a waitress at Paradise Cove Resort, a sprawling complex in the tourist district where foreigners paid more for one meal than her family spent on groceries in a month. She worked double shifts, sending every spare peso home, watching her mother's hands continue to bleed, while her siblings at least had full bellies and school supplies. Male tourists flirted constantly. She'd learned to smile and deflect, to be friendly enough for good tips but distant enough to avoid complications. She wasn't looking for Prince Charming. She was looking for an exit visa from desperation. December 8, 2020. Paradise Cove Resort Restaurant, lunch shift. Tina was counting coins in the break room, a calculator showing her she was 2,000 pesos short for her sister's school uniform. The weight of that deficit pressed against her chest like a physical thing. Her hands smelled like grease from the kitchen, and her feet ached from hours on tile floors, and she was so tired of being tired. That's when James Mitchell walked into the restaurant for the first time. 58 years old, with graying hair kept meticulously neat and the kind of expensive casual where that whispered wealth rather than shouting it. He had a wedding ring tan line on his left hand, recently removed, and the bearing of a man accustomed to being obeyed. James Mitchell was a retired mining executive from Sydney, Australia, who had relocated to Manila 6 months earlier with a comfortable pension, property investments, and an estimated net worth of $2.3 million. He'd been married to Margaret for 31 years in Sydney. They had 2 children, Emma, 29, a lawyer who had stopped returning his calls after the divorce, and David, 26, an engineer who sent obligatory birthday messages and nothing more. The marriage had ended when James discovered Margaret's affair with her personal trainer. He documented that affair for 8 months before confronting her. Phone records, credit card statements, private investigator reports, photographs time-stamped and organized in color-coded folders. He'd presented the evidence like a prosecutor, watching her face crumble, feeling something close to satisfaction at finally having proof of the betrayal his paranoia had always suspected. The divorce finalized 6 months before he met Tina. James relocated to Manila because in Sydney he was a pathetic divorced man whose wife had found him insufficient. But in Manila, his money made him important again. In Manila, young women smiled at him not despite his age, but with genuine curiosity. Or so he believed. What James Mitchell actually suffered from was a controlling nature masked as protectiveness, paranoid tendencies that had manifested in checking Margaret's phone constantly even before discovering the affair, and a transactional view of relationships that reduced love to economics and loyalty to contractual obligation. He carried a racial superiority complex he would never have admitted to possessing, showing itself in small ways. The way he spoke slower to Filipinos regardless of their English fluency. The assumptions he made about motivations and morals. The belief that his money granted him not just access but ownership. His defining trait was meticulous planning. He had documented Margaret's affair for 8 months, building an airtight case before ever confronting her. Patience was a weapon he wielded with surgical precision. Tina served his table 4 times in 2 weeks. He left 500% tips, asked her name, made small talk that felt respectful rather than predatory. On his 5th visit, he asked her to dinner outside of work. She stood in the break room afterward, staring at his business card, having an internal debate that felt like standing at a crossroads in the dark. This man was old enough to be her father, but her father was dead, and this man had more money than her entire barangay combined. She thought about her mother's bleeding hands, her siblings' futures, the grinding mathematics of poverty that never balanced no matter how hard she worked. She thought about what he might want from her, and what she might be willing to give in exchange for security. She called him that evening. Their courtship lasted 4 months. James took her to expensive dinners at Sky Garden Restaurant in Emerald Bay Hotel, where the menu had no prices and the view stretched across Manila Bay like a promise. He bought her gifts, a new phone so they could text more easily, a designer bag she immediately sold and sent the money home, though he never knew. His pitch was refreshingly honest in its transactional nature. "I'm lonely in Manila," he told her over wine that cost more than her monthly salary. "You're struggling. We could help each other. I can provide security. You can provide companionship. It doesn't have to be complicated. No pretense of love initially, just mutual benefit." Tina found that honesty almost comforting. At least he wasn't lying to her. The proposal came in April 2021, 4 months after their first dinner. He invited her to his penthouse apartment. She'd never seen it before. Celestial Heights Tower, 24th floor, 3 bedrooms of luxury that made her childhood home feel like a cardboard box in comparison. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Marble countertops, air conditioning that worked perfectly, space to breathe. "I can give you security," James said, holding a small velvet box. "Your family will never worry about money again. Your siblings can finish school. Your mother can stop destroying her hands. I just need loyalty. Complete, absolute loyalty." Tina looked at the ring. 2-carat diamond that cost more than she would earn in 5 years of double shifts. She did the mathematics. Mother's medical bills, siblings' education, escape from poverty's endless calculation of insufficient resources. She thought about what loyalty meant and whether she could perform it convincingly enough. "Yes," she said, "not from love, from mathematics." They married on June 12, 2021. Small ceremony at Serenity Chapel in Manila. 15 guests total. Her family crying with joy and relief, her mother's bleeding hands wrapped in clean bandages for the occasion, her siblings dressed in new clothes that still had creases from the store packaging. His family absent. Emma and David had declined to attend their father's wedding to a woman young enough to be their sister. On her wedding night, Tina lay beside her new husband in the master bedroom of the penthouse and thought, "I can do this. People endure worse for less. This is survival. This is strategy. This is the price of security." She didn't know yet that she'd bought her family's future with her own death warrant. The first year of marriage was a slow suffocation disguised as generosity. The penthouse became her prison, beautiful and suffocating. James's rules emerged gradually, like water rising around her feet until she realized she was drowning. He gave her a weekly allowance that was generous by any standard, but every expenditure was tracked, questioned, and categorized. He was insulted when she suggested getting a job, as if her employment would reflect poorly on his ability to provide. Friends required his approval before visiting. Her phone had location sharing activated, for safety. He checked it weekly with a casualness that didn't hide the interrogation. Where had she been? Who had she talked to? Why had the building guard smiled at her that way? Was she sure she hadn't been flirting? He moved her family to a new house, his property, his leverage. He paid her siblings' school fees directly, ensuring she never touched the money, never had the power to reallocate it. He employed her mother as a housekeeper in their building, keeping her nearby but controlled. The message was clear: everything you have, I provide. Everything you love, I can take away. Daily life became a performance. Breakfast at 7 a.m. sharp because James valued military precision. He worked from home, consulting remotely for mining companies, always present, always watching. Her days consisted of the building gym, cooking meals she'd learned to make exactly how he preferred, and waiting. Waiting for him to finish work. Waiting for permission to leave the apartment. Waiting for her life to feel like her own. Evenings brought interrogations disguised as conversation. "Who did you talk to today?" he'd ask over dinner, his tone light but his eyes sharp. The guard seemed friendly. "What did you two discuss?" Or worse, "Your phone shows you searched for divorce laws in the Philippines. Just curious? Or planning something?" James was never physically abusive. He was too intelligent for evidence that obvious. He was financially generous, giving her no grounds for complaint that outsiders would recognize. Publicly, his social media showed a devoted husband with posts about "my beautiful wife" and anniversary countdowns. Privately, he tracked her movements, monitored her communications, and slowly isolated her from any relationship he couldn't control or observe. Tina learned to lie smoothly. Survival in poverty had already taught her that skill. Survival in marriage simply required applying it differently. She deleted search histories. She smiled through his interrogations. She sent money to her siblings by carefully reselling his gifts without his knowledge. She developed an internal mantra that she repeated during the worst moments. "This is still better than Barangay San Isidro. I can endure this. I've endured worse." But 17 months into her marriage, as she stood in the break room of Sacred Heart Community Church where James occasionally allowed her to volunteer, Tina realized she couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed genuinely. Couldn't remember what hope felt like. Couldn't remember the woman she'd been before she'd traded herself for her family's security. That's when Richard Morrison walked into her life and reminded her that kindness still existed in the world. She just didn't know yet that kindness would be the thing that killed her. November 3, 2022. Sacred Heart Community Church, Volunteer Soup Kitchen, 4:30 in the afternoon. The Manila heat hung heavy even as the sun began its descent, and the kitchen smelled of rice, vegetables, and the particular mixture of hope and desperation that characterized places where the hungry came to be fed. Tina stood at the serving line, ladling soup into bowls with the mechanical efficiency of someone whose mind was elsewhere. James had allowed her to volunteer here because it made him look charitable, because the religious community felt safe to him, and because he could control the environment. Tuesdays and Thursdays, 3 to 6 p.m. He dropped her off precisely on time and picked her up exactly 3 hours later with the punctuality of a warden collecting a prisoner. That's when she first noticed the elderly American man serving beside her. Tall and lean, with sun-weathered skin and white hair that looked silver in the fluorescent lights. He wore his 71 years comfortably, without the desperate attempts at youth that characterized so many expats she'd encountered. His eyes were gentle, genuinely so, and when he smiled at the people they served, the expression reached those eyes and transformed his entire face. Richard Morrison had arrived in Manila 18 months earlier on a 6-month tourist visa, extending it repeatedly because returning to his empty Portland house felt impossible after Eleanor's death. Technically still a tourist, though he'd begun to think of the Philippines as home. He had been a high school history teacher in Portland, Oregon for 40 years. He'd married Eleanor when they were both 23, fresh out of college and convinced they could change the world one classroom at a time. They'd wanted children, but Eleanor couldn't conceive, and they'd eventually made peace with being everyone's favorite uncle and aunt instead. 45 years of marriage ended when cancer took Eleanor 3 years before Richard arrived in Manila. The house they'd shared in Portland became unbearable in its emptiness, every room echoing with her absence. His teacher's pension went further in the Philippines than it would in Oregon, and he'd found purpose in volunteering. Teaching English to children, serving meals at the church, filling the silence that grief had left behind. Richard Morrison was genuinely kind, not naively so, but with the earned wisdom of someone who'd spent decades working with teenagers and learned to recognize the difference between performed emotion and authentic feeling. He noticed Tina's forced smiles immediately. "You smile a lot," he said during a quiet moment between serving rushes, his voice carrying the gentle observation of someone used to reading students' faces. "But your eyes don't." occupational hazard of mine. I taught teenagers for 40 years. I learned to spot the difference between real happiness and performance. Tina's automatic deflection kicked in. Just tired. If you ever want to talk about that tiredness, Richard replied, not pushing, just offering. I'm a good listener. No judgment, no advice unless you ask. Just listening. She felt suspicious first. What did he want? Men didn't offer kindness without expecting something in return. But there was no calculation in his expression, no hidden agenda in his eyes, just genuine concern from a lonely old man who'd learned to recognize lonely young women. She filed the offer away and said nothing, but their volunteer schedules overlapped. Tuesdays and Thursdays, both serving from 3 to 6 p.m., and conversations became inevitable. Richard talked about his life in Portland, stories of students who'd gone on to do remarkable things, Eleanor's garden that had been her pride and joy. Tina shared carefully curated versions of her background. The poverty, yes. The struggle, yes. The misery in her marriage, no. They discovered a shared love of classic films. The church showed movies on Friday nights, and Richard mentioned his favorite was Casablanca. Tina had seen it once on television, had loved the tragedy of Ilsa and Rick, the beautiful impossibility of their love. They talked about other films, books, the kind of conversation that felt like water after years of drought. In their third week of overlapping shifts, Richard asked the question that cracked her armor. Are you happy? Her automatic lie came smoothly. Yes, very blessed. He nodded, accepting the deflection, but added gently, I'm glad, though I've noticed your husband picks you up with the exact energy of a warden collecting a prisoner. Just an observation. The accuracy of that observation left her breathless. By their second month of friendship, Tina found herself looking forward to Tuesdays and Thursdays with an intensity that frightened her. These 6 hours per week became the only time she felt like herself. They started having coffee at Grace Cafe 2 blocks from the church, public and innocent. She created a hidden messaging app on her phone, encrypted, deleted daily. They texted about books, philosophy, the small observations that made life bearable. Richard told her about his grief over Eleanor. I still talk to her, he admitted one afternoon over coffee. Ask her what she'd think of my choices, whether she'd approve of me being here, whether she'd understand why I couldn't stay in that empty house. Tina confided things she'd never told anyone. The guilt over choosing money over love. The fear that she'd become her mother, trapped by circumstances beyond her control. The resentment toward James that she masked as gratitude every single day. The catalyst came in January 2023. Tina's phone rang during volunteer work, James calling for the third time in an hour. She stepped away, and Richard overheard her side of the conversation. Yes, I'm still at church. No, just Richard and Father Miguel, 71 years old. Yes, I'll be ready at 6 o'clock sharp. I love you too. That last part automatic, hollow, a performance so practiced it required no thought. When she returned, her hands were shaking. Richard said nothing, but his eyes held questions he was too kind to ask aloud. Later, while they cleaned the kitchen, he finally spoke. Tina, you don't have to tell me anything, but if you ever need a friend who won't judge, who won't tell, who will just listen, I'm here. 2 weeks later, she broke. January 15th, 2023. After volunteer work, setting up chairs for the next day's service, her hands trembled so badly she dropped a stack of hymnals. Richard touched her shoulder gently, and that small kindness shattered the dam she'd built around her emotions. The words poured out in a rush. James had accused her of flirting with the produce vendor at the market. 3 hours of interrogation about why she'd smiled that way. Threats to stop paying her siblings' school fees as punishment for her disrespect. Making her apologize on her knees for making him feel insecure, for failing to appreciate his generosity, for being ungrateful. Richard listened without interrupting, without minimizing, without offering hollow platitudes. When she finally stopped crying, he said simply, That's not love, Tina. That's control. And you don't deserve it. It was the first time anyone had named what she couldn't. Their relationship deepened after that confession. Conversations extended beyond volunteer hours. Text messages became more frequent, more personal. She told him about her dreams beyond mere survival, to travel, to learn, to live without calculating the cost of every choice. He shared his loneliness, the grief that still caught him by surprise 3 years after Eleanor's death, the way he'd found purpose again through their friendship. The boundaries between friendship and something more began to blur. In March 2023, when Tina's mother was hospitalized with pneumonia, James allowed her one supervised hour at the hospital. Richard showed up unannounced because she'd mentioned it in a text. He stayed 6 hours, talked to doctors, held Tina while she cried, and reminded her that she wasn't alone. James's suspicion activated that day, but Richard's age provided camouflage. Surely a 71-year-old man posed no threat to a marriage. The turning point came on April 8, 2023, in the church basement storage room while they organized donation boxes. Tina was sorting through clothes when the words escaped before she could stop them. "Sometimes I imagine what life would be if I'd met you first, when you were younger, when I had choices instead of just survival calculations." Richard looked at her with an expression that mixed sorrow and understanding. "Age is just years, Tina, but circumstances are prison bars." The kiss happened like inevitability, like gravity. Not passionate but tender, desperate, sorrowful. They pulled apart almost immediately, both horrified and exhilarated. "We can't do this," Richard said, but his hand still held hers. "You're married. I'm too old." "This is the only time I've felt alive in 3 years," Tina finished. The affair began 1 week later. They met at Harborview Inn, a budget hotel 30 minutes from the church that accepted cash and asked no questions. James thought Tina was attending extended volunteer training sessions. The church community thought she'd gone home. The lies came easier than either of them expected. Their first time together was on April 15, 2023, in room 207. The afternoon light filtered through cheap curtains, and the air conditioning rattled, and nothing about it was glamorous or romantic in the traditional sense. But Richard touched her like she was precious, listened when she spoke, asked what she wanted instead of taking what he needed. The intimacy went beyond physical. They talked for hours before and after, about everything and nothing, building a relationship in stolen moments. "I love you," Richard said in May, after their 5th meeting, the words carrying the weight of confession and apology. Tina's tears came immediately. "I can't say that back, not while I'm his, but I feel it. God help me, I feel it." They planned imaginary futures during those afternoons at Harborview Inn. Tina would divorce James, lose everything, except poverty again. Richard's modest pension could cover basics, a small apartment, simple, meals, the freedom to choose. They knew it was fantasy, knew the logistics were impossible, but the dreaming itself became necessary for survival. For 3 months, April through June 2023, they maintained their affair with careful precision. Encrypted messages deleted immediately, cash transactions leaving no paper trail, public interactions at church remaining professional and appropriate. They convinced themselves they were being careful enough, smart enough, safe enough. They convinced themselves that James's paranoia had limits, that his surveillance had boundaries, that love could exist in the spaces between his watching. They were wrong on every count, because while Tina was falling in love with Richard Morrison's kindness, while Richard was rediscovering purpose through their impossible relationship, James Mitchell was watching, documenting, and planning their destruction with the methodical patience that had always been his greatest weapon. On July 2, 2023, when Tina returned from Harborview Inn with reapplied lipstick and a genuine smile, James noticed. His suspicion, dormant but never dead, activated like a sleeping virus finding new cells to infect. By July 15th, he'd hired Victor Cruz from Crimson Eye Investigations. By August 20th, he had 347 photographs, 18 hours of audio recordings, and a complete understanding of his wife's betrayal. And by September, James Mitchell had decided that divorce was too expensive, too humiliating, and far too merciful. Tina and Richard had no idea that their careful deception had failed months ago. They had no idea that every kiss, every whispered confession of love, every imagined future had been documented and filed away as evidence. They had no idea that kindness had signed both their death warrants, and that the execution was already being planned with surgical precision. July 2, 2023. The moment Tina walked through the penthouse door, James knew. She was smiling differently, the kind of smile that came from somewhere deep and genuine, the kind she'd never given him in 2 years of marriage. Her lipstick had been reapplied, carefully but not carefully enough. The shade was slightly off from what she'd worn that morning, and James Mitchell noticed everything. "How was church?" he asked, his tone casual, almost disinterested. "Good. We served over 200 people today." Her answer came smoothly, practiced, but there was a lightness in her voice that hadn't existed before. "You seem happy, just grateful to help." She moved toward the bedroom, but James stopped her with a question that landed like a blade. "You don't wear lipstick to serve soup, Tina. You left here with bare lips. You came back with red ones. Want to tell me where you really were?" Her hesitation lasted only a second, but it was enough. I stopped at the pharmacy on the way home. Bought new lipstick. Tried it in the car." The lie was good, almost believable, but James had been married before. He'd tracked Margaret's lies for 8 months before confronting her, documenting every inconsistency, every deviation from pattern. He knew the sound of deception, could taste it in the air like copper. "Show me the receipt," he said. "I threw it away." "Show me the lipstick then." Tina's face went pale. She'd left it at Harborview Inn, on the nightstand in room 207, next to Richard's reading glasses. It's in my purse. I'll get it." She went to retrieve her bag, and James watched her movements with the cold assessment of a predator studying prey. She was lying. The question wasn't whether she was being unfaithful. He could feel that truth in his bones, but with whom and how extensively and what he should do about it. Divorce would cost millions. Margaret had taken half of everything despite being the one who cheated, because Australian courts didn't care about morality, only mathematics. James refused to be robbed twice. If Tina wanted to betray him, to make him look foolish, to take what he'd given her and share it with someone else, then she would pay a price far steeper than legal proceedings. On July 10th, James made a surprise visit to Sacred Heart Church during volunteer hours. He'd never done this before, had always trusted the controlled environment, but instinct demanded verification. He found Tina organizing food donations with an elderly white man who moved with the careful precision of someone navigating aging joints. "Darling," James said, and watched Tina jump like she'd been electrocuted. "Thought I'd come see the good work you're doing." "James, I wasn't expecting. This is Richard Morrison. He volunteers here too." "Richard, this is my husband." The old man extended his hand, his grip firm despite his age. "Pleasure to meet you. Your wife is wonderful with the community. Very dedicated." James studied him with the intensity of an entomologist examining an insect. 71 if he was a day. White hair, weathered skin, gentle eyes. No wedding ring. American accent. Modest clothing that spoke of limited means. This man was his competition? This elderly, poor, unremarkable foreigner? But then he saw it. The way Richard handed Tina a box of canned goods, his fingers lingering just a fraction too long. The way she smiled at him, genuine warmth transforming her entire face. The micro-expression of comfort that existed between them, the kind that only came from extensive time spent together. James left the church 15 minutes later, having confirmed what his instincts had screamed. This old man, this nobody, had somehow become more important to his wife than he was. The humiliation burned like acid. On July 15, 2023, James hired Victor Cruz. Victor Cruz was 45, a former Manila Police Department detective who'd built a thriving private investigation business specializing in marital infidelity. His office in Makati displayed licenses, certifications, and a wall of testimonials from satisfied clients. His fee was 150,000 Cuban pesos for initial retainer, and he guaranteed results within 30 days. "I need to know everything," James told him during their first meeting. "Where she goes, who she sees, what she says. I want photographs, audio recordings, timeline analysis. I want proof that would stand up in any court." Victor nodded, making notes on his tablet. "The subject is your wife, Celestina Mitchell?" "Yes, I believe she's having an affair with an American man. Richard Morrison, 71, volunteers at Sacred Heart Church. I need you to confirm the affair and document its extent." "And if there's no affair?" James's smile was cold. "There is. I just need you to prove it." The surveillance began immediately. Victor was thorough, professional, invisible. He confirmed Tina's church volunteer schedule, photographed her interactions with Richard, tracked her movements with GPS devices planted on her purse. For the first week, everything appeared innocent. Church volunteering, coffee at a nearby cafe, conversations that seemed friendly but appropriate. Then came July 25, 2023, Tuesday afternoon. Tina left Sacred Heart Church at 5:30 p.m., 30 minutes earlier than usual. Victor followed her taxi to Harborview Inn, a budget hotel in a neighborhood where foreigners rarely ventured. She entered the lobby, paid cash for a room, and received a key to room 207. 10 minutes later, Richard Morrison arrived in his own taxi. He entered the same hotel, walked directly to room 207 without stopping at the front desk, and the door opened before he could knock. Tina had been waiting for him. Victor photographed everything. The timestamps, the room number, both subjects entering separately. He rented room 206, the adjacent unit, and within an hour had installed a listening device through the shared wall. The audio quality wasn't perfect, but it was sufficient. What he recorded over the next 4 weeks would provide James Mitchell with everything he needed to destroy them both. The first recording, July 25, 5:47 p.m. to 6:52 p.m., captured conversation interspersed with silence that spoke volumes. Victor heard Richard's voice. "I love you, Tina. I know this is impossible, but I do." He heard her crying response. "If I could go back, change how we met, give you the life you deserve." He heard the unmistakable sounds of physical intimacy, and afterward, the kind of vulnerable conversation that only happened between people who dropped all pretense. "When you divorce him," Richard said, "my pension could support us modestly. Nothing fancy, but we'd be together. Isn't that what matters?" "He'll destroy me if I leave," Tina replied. "He'll take everything from my family. The house he bought them, my siblings' school fees, my mother's job. He's made sure I can't leave without destroying everyone I love. Then we'll figure something else out. There has to be a way." Victor documented 12 encounters over the next 4 weeks. Each meeting followed the same pattern. Separate arrivals at Harborview Inn, 1 to 2 hours in room 207, careful departures staggered by 10 minutes. The audio recordings filled 18 hours of storage. Conversations about love, about future plans, about the impossibility of their situation and their refusal to end it anyway. The photographs numbered 347 by the time Victor compiled his final report. Tina and Richard entering the hotel from different angles. Timestamps proving pattern and premeditation. Hotel registration records showing fake names, Maria Santos and John Williams. Cash withdrawal records from Tina's account matching the dates and amounts of hotel visits. On August 20, 2023, Victor Cruz delivered his evidence portfolio to James Mitchell in a sealed manila envelope. The report was comprehensive. Background checks on Richard Morrison, timeline analysis of the affair, financial tracking, photographic evidence, and audio recordings organized chronologically with transcripts. James read the report alone in his study, the door locked, his face expressionless. 347 photographs of his wife entering a budget hotel with a man old enough to be her grandfather. 18 hours of audio documenting their affair, their love, their plans for a future that didn't include him. Evidence of systematic betrayal spanning 4 months. But what struck him most was a single line from one of the transcripts, dated August 10th. "James doesn't own your heart, Tina. He just rents your time. And eventually, even rental agreements end." The old man was right. James had purchased Tina's compliance, her presence, her performance of wifely devotion. But he'd never owned her heart, and now someone else did. Someone poor and old and unremarkable had succeeded where James, with all his money and control, had failed. Most men would have raged. Some would have filed for divorce. Others might have confronted the lovers, demanded explanations, sought closure. James Mitchell did none of these things. Instead, he opened his laptop and began researching methods of murder that mimicked natural causes. He searched using Tor browser, encrypted connections, techniques that left no digital footprint. He read about poisons that were difficult to detect, symptoms that resembled heart attacks or strokes, substances available commercially without raising suspicion. By September 1st, he'd selected his weapon, ethylene glycol, commonly known as antifreeze. By September 15th, he'd purchased it from 3 different automotive stores, paying cash, spreading the transactions across different dates and locations to avoid pattern recognition. By September 30th, he'd developed his complete plan. Murder Tina, frame Richard, collect the life insurance, destroy both of them so thoroughly that even in death, they'd be separated by scandal and disgrace. The decision to frame Richard came naturally. Divorce would cost James millions and allow Tina and Richard to eventually be together, poor but happy. That was unacceptable. Death alone wasn't sufficient punishment for making James Mitchell look foolish. They needed to suffer, to be destroyed, to have even their memory tainted by scandal. James hired a second investigator, Marco Delgado, who specialized in document fraud. For 500,000 Cuban pesos, Marco created an evidence trail that didn't exist. Email threads backdated to show Tina and Richard plotting James's murder, love letters in Richard's forged handwriting promising to eliminate the obstacle to their happiness, a revised will with Tina's signature leaving half her estate to Richard Morrison. The forgeries were perfect, professional, indistinguishable from authentic documents to anyone without access to advanced forensic analysis. Marco had learned his craft creating false identification papers for people escaping dangerous situations. Using those skills for murder felt morally complicated, but the money was too good to refuse. James collected Richard's DNA like a hunter collecting trophies. He attended church services for the first time in months, positioned himself near Richard during fellowship, retrieved the coffee cup Richard had used. He brushed against the old man in crowded spaces, transferred hair and skin cells to plastic bags stored in his freezer. He paid Victor Cruz to retrieve Richard's trash from Tranquil Gardens retirement community, obtaining razors and tissues that contained DNA samples. The evidence was planted throughout the penthouse. Richard's hair in the bedroom, his fingerprints on a wine glass, digital traces suggesting he'd been in the apartment when James wasn't home. The fabrication was meticulous, layered, designed to withstand initial investigation and create reasonable doubt about any alternative theory. James selected March 15, 2024 as his target date, their third wedding anniversary. The poetic justice appealed to him. 3 years ago, Tina had promised loyalty. 3 years later, he would punish her betrayal on the exact anniversary of those broken vows. He planned the dinner menu carefully. Tom yum soup as the main course, its strong flavors of chili, lemongrass, and lime perfect for masking the sweet taste of antifreeze. He calculated the dosage. 150 milliliters would be fatal but not immediate, allowing 2 to 4 hours of symptoms before death. Time enough for what he needed to do. The staff would be given the night off. A romantic gesture, he'd explain. Anniversary dinner cooked by loving husband. No witnesses, no complications. After Tina's death, he would call emergency services in hysterics. The hospital would initially suspect natural causes. A heart attack, perhaps tragic but not unheard of in young people. The autopsy would reveal poisoning, and investigation would begin. That's when the anonymous tip would come. A concerned citizen reporting suspicious behavior by Richard Morrison. Police would investigate, find the planted emails, the forged letters, the falsified financial records. They'd discover the affair, establish motive, and find DNA evidence placing Richard in the penthouse. Richard would be arrested, tried, and convicted. An elderly American man who'd murdered his young lover for money, then planned to kill her wealthy husband. The narrative wrote itself. James would play the devastated widower, grieving both his wife's death and the betrayal that preceded it. He'd collect 15 million Cuban pesos in life insurance. He'd file civil suits seizing Richard's pension and assets as restitution for wrongful death. He'd emerge financially enriched, publicly sympathetic, and privately victorious. Perfect symmetry, perfect revenge. As Christmas 2023 approached, James became exceptionally attentive to Tina. Expensive gifts, romantic gestures, social media posts celebrating their marriage. He needed to establish his devotion publicly, needed witnesses to his love, needed the narrative of heartbroken husband already in place before the murder. Tina, guilt-ridden over her continued affair with Richard, interpreted James's kindness as genuine change. Maybe he was finally learning to love her properly. Maybe she could make this marriage work. Maybe she should end things with Richard, accept her gilded cage, and stop reaching for impossible happiness. She had no idea that James's kindness was the cruelest part of his plan. He was saying goodbye, letting her enjoy her final months, watching her smile and knowing that soon she would die believing Richard would be blamed. By March 2024, everything was ready. The poison purchased and hidden, the evidence planted and waiting, the anniversary dinner planned down to the minute. James Mitchell had spent 8 months orchestrating the perfect murder, and now he just needed to execute it. On March 12th, Tina and Richard met at Harborview Inn for what would be their last time together, though neither knew it. Richard sensed something was wrong. "Has James said anything about me?" he asked, holding Tina's hand across the cheap hotel bedspread. "No, he doesn't suspect. We've been so careful. I think we should stop for a while. Just until after the anniversary," Tina interrupted. "Let me get through this dinner, then we'll talk about our future. Really talk, really plan, really decide." Their last text exchange came on March 14th, the day before the anniversary dinner. "Richard, I love you. Be safe tomorrow." "Tina, I love you too. This time tomorrow I'll have decided about us." Really decided. She meant it. Tina had decided to choose Richard, to accept poverty over prison, to finally choose happiness over security. She was going to tell James she wanted a divorce, consequences be damned. She was going to ask for her freedom on the same night James had planned to take her life. The irony would have been beautiful if it weren't so tragic. March 15th, 2024. The morning arrived with Manila's typical humidity, the sun rising over the bay like a promise the city had no intention of keeping. Tina woke to find a dozen roses on her bedside table, their red petals perfect and their thorns carefully removed. The card read, "3 years ago, you made me the happiest man alive. Tonight we celebrate forever. Love, James." She held the card, feeling the weight of guilt press against her chest. James was trying. He'd been so kind lately, so attentive, so much like the man she'd hoped he might become. And here she was, planning to destroy their marriage, to choose an elderly American with a modest pension over the security James had provided for her entire family. Her phone vibrated. Richard's text, "Thinking of you today. Whatever you decide about us, I understand." Tina stared at both messages, the card and the text, the husband and the lover, the security and the happiness. She'd made her decision weeks ago, but the finality of it terrified her. Tonight, after the anniversary dinner, she would tell James the truth. She would ask for a divorce. She would lose everything and gain the only thing that mattered, the freedom to choose her own life. She had no idea she wouldn't survive the night. James woke early, his mind running through the plan with the precision of a military operation. The antifreeze was in his study safe, 150 milliliters measured exactly into a small flask. The staff had been given the night off with generous bonuses and instructions not to return until tomorrow afternoon. The tom yum soup recipe was memorized, the ingredients purchased from different markets to avoid any single transaction being memorable. He'd reviewed Victor Cruz's surveillance reports one final time last night, looking at photographs of Tina and Richard together, reading transcripts of their conversations about love and future plans. The rage had calcified into something colder, more useful. Rage made people sloppy. What James felt now was surgical precision. "Good morning, darling," he said when Tina emerged from the bedroom, kissing her cheek with practiced tenderness. "Happy anniversary." "Happy anniversary," she replied, and her smile was sad in a way he didn't bother to interpret. James had planned the entire day as a farewell gift. Expensive brunch at Sky Garden Restaurant, the same place where he'd courted her 3 years ago. The staff recognized them, congratulated them on their anniversary, brought champagne they hadn't ordered. Tina laughed at something the waiter said, and James photographed her with his phone, posting it to social media. 3 years with this beautiful woman, blessed beyond measure. #AnniversaryLove, #forevermine. The post would be important later. Evidence of his devotion, his public celebration of their marriage, his apparent ignorance of any problem. The comments flooded in immediately, friends congratulating them, acquaintances praising their relationship, strangers sending heart emojis into the digital void. After brunch, James took Tina shopping. Greenbelt Mall, luxury stores where the salespeople knew him by name. He bought her diamond earrings, 180,000 Cuban pesos worth of glittering evidence of his generosity. She protested that it was too much, and he insisted, and the saleswoman wrapped them in elegant packaging while running his credit card. "You deserve beautiful things," James said, fastening the earrings to Tina's ears himself, his fingers gentle against her skin. "You've made me so happy." Tina felt tears threaten. He'd never been this tender, this present, this genuinely affectionate. Guilt crashed over her in waves. Maybe she was making a mistake. Maybe she should give this marriage another chance. Maybe James could change, was changing, had already changed. The afternoon brought a couple's massage at Serenity Wellness Center. Side-by-side tables, essential oils, soft music, the kind of manufactured intimacy that wealthy people purchased when genuine connection proved elusive. Tina tried to relax, but her mind kept circling back to the conversation she needed to have tonight. How would she say it? How would James react? Would he hurt her family out of spite? Or would he let them keep the house, the school fees, the stability she'd purchased with 3 years of her life? James, on the adjacent table, felt nothing but calm certainty. By midnight, all of this would be over. Tina would be dead. Richard would be implicated. The performance of loving husband would be complete, captured in receipts and photographs and social media posts that painted him as devoted and unsuspecting. They returned to the penthouse at 5 p.m. James sent Tina to rest while he prepared dinner, an unprecedented gesture that should have raised suspicion but instead touched her heart. He'd never cooked for her before, had never wanted to, had treated the kitchen like staff territory. This felt significant, like he was finally trying to build something real between them. In the kitchen, James moved with methodical efficiency. The tom yum soup required careful preparation. He made 2 separate pots, identical in appearance but different in content. The poison soup went into a specific bowl, a small scratch on the rim marking it as Tina's. His own soup remained untainted, drawn from the second pot. At 6:15 p.m., alone in the kitchen with both pots simmering, James retrieved the flask from his study. The antifreeze poured smoothly into Tina's soup, 150 milliliters disappearing into the spicy red broth. He stirred thoroughly, ensuring complete integration. The sweet taste of ethylene glycol would be masked by chili, lemongrass, and lime. She would never know what killed her until it was too late. Tina dressed in a red gown, James's favorite color, on her. She applied makeup carefully, sprayed Chanel perfume, looked at herself in the mirror, and tried to see the woman she'd been before this marriage. That woman felt like a ghost, someone who died 3 years ago in a small chapel while making promises she couldn't keep to a man she didn't love. Tonight, she would reclaim herself. Tonight, she would be honest. Tonight, she would choose happiness over security, love over survival, Richard over James. Tonight, she would die. The dining table was set with candles and expensive china when Tina emerged from the bedroom. James had dimmed the lights, put on soft music, created the atmosphere of romance he'd rarely bothered with during their marriage. He pulled out her chair, poured wine into crystal glasses, served the first course of fresh lumpia with a flourish. "To 3 years of marriage," James said, raising his glass. "To 3 years," Tina echoed. "Thank you for everything you've given me and my family." They ate the appetizers slowly, making conversation that felt almost natural. James asked if she was happy, really happy, and Tina hesitated before answering. "I'm grateful to you, care about you. I'm trying to love you better." James smiled, finding dark humor in her honesty. "That's an interesting answer. Not yes, but honest. I appreciate honesty." The dramatic irony would have been funny if it weren't about to become tragic. Tina was preparing to be more honest than she'd been in years, while James was executing his most elaborate deception. At 8 p.m., he brought out the soup. 2 bowls, identical in appearance, but one marked with a tiny scratch visible only to him. He placed the poisoned bowl in front of Tina with the care of a man serving his beloved wife a meal prepared with his own hands. "Tom yum, your favorite. I made it extra spicy the way you like." Tina took her first spoonful and smiled genuinely. "This is delicious. You've been hiding cooking skills from me." James watched every spoonful she consumed, counting them mentally. 1, 2, 5, 10. She finished the entire bowl over the course of 15 minutes, approximately 12 ounces of soup containing 150 milliliters of antifreeze now in her system. The poison began its work immediately, though the symptoms started subtly. By 8:15 p.m., as James served the main course of grilled fish, Tina felt slightly dizzy. "Too much wine too fast," she said, laughing it off. "Take some water," James suggested, his voice solicitous and concerned. The dizziness intensified. Warmth flushed through her body, and mild nausea made the fish suddenly unappetizing. "I might have eaten too quickly," she said, pressing a hand to her stomach. "Are you all right, darling?" "Fine, just need a moment." But it wasn't fine. By 8:30 p.m., the nausea had become severe. Tina stood from the table too quickly, stumbled, grabbed the edge for support. The wine glass fell from her hand and shattered against the marble floor, red liquid spreading like blood, like prophecy, like the end of everything. "James," she said, and her voice shook. "Something's wrong. I don't feel right." "Sit down," he said, but he didn't move to help her. He watched with clinical interest as the poison progressed through her system, as her body began to recognize that something foreign and deadly was coursing through her bloodstream. "Before we continue," James said, his tone conversational, "I want to talk about something." Tina looked at him through increasingly blurred vision. "What is it?" "I want to talk about Richard Morrison." The blood drained from her face. Her hands began to tremble. "Who?" "Don't insult me further with lies, Tina." James stood, walked to the sideboard, and retrieved a manila folder. He spread its contents across the table. Photographs of her and Richard entering Harborview Inn, timestamps, transcripts of their conversations, evidence of systematic betrayal spanning months. "I've known since July," he said calmly. "I hired investigators. I heard everything. My pension could support us modestly. Very touching. You were willing to trade my millions for his social security checks." Tina's tears came immediately, mixing with the sweat now beading on her forehead. "James, please let me explain." "No need. I understand perfectly." He paused, watching her sway in her chair, watching the poison work. "How are you feeling, by the way? Dizzy? Nauseous?" "That's the ethylene glycol. Antifreeze. I put it in your soup." Her eyes widened in horror and disbelief. "What? You're dying, Tina. The doctors will think it's a heart condition. Tragic but natural. But here's the beautiful part. Richard, your sweet Richard, will be arrested within 48 hours. The convulsions started then, her body jerking as the poison attacked her organs. She tried to stand, to run, to reach for her phone, but her coordination was failing. "You're framing him?" "Brilliantly, yes. His DNA is all over this apartment. His fingerprints on wine glasses. Emails showing you two planned to kill me for life insurance. A will you allegedly signed leaving him half my money. Financial records showing transfers to his account. All fabricated, all perfect, all waiting for police to discover." Tina crawled toward the door, each movement agony, her vision tunneling. "Richard, innocent, please." James knelt beside her, his voice gentle and cruel. He should have kept his kindness to himself. "You should have been loyal." "I paid for loyalty, Tina. You breached our contract." At 9:23 p.m., Celestina Tina Flores died on the kitchen floor of her penthouse apartment. 24 years old, 3 years married, killed by the man who'd promised to protect her. Her last thought was of Richard, and how James was going to destroy him, and how her choice to love someone kind had doomed them both. James waited 4 minutes before calling 911, timing it perfectly to seem like he'd desperately tried CPR before admitting defeat. "My wife!" he screamed into the phone, his acting flawless. "She's not breathing. We were having dinner and she just collapsed. Please, send someone. Our anniversary. Oh God, please hurry." The performance had begun, and James Mitchell had always been an excellent performer. The paramedics arrived at 9:27 p.m., their uniforms crisp and their movements practiced, having no idea they were entering a crime scene disguised as a tragedy. They found James Mitchell kneeling beside his wife's body, his hands covered in her vomit, his face a masterpiece of devastated confusion. He'd messed his hair, torn his shirt slightly, created the physical evidence of a man who desperately tried to save the woman he loved. "She just collapsed," he gasped between sobs that sounded genuine because he'd practiced them. "We were celebrating our anniversary." She said she felt dizzy and then, "Please, you have to help her." The senior paramedic, a woman named Dr. Sophia Flores, checked for vital signs she knew she wouldn't find. Tina's body was still warm, but her pupils were fixed and dilated, her skin already taking on the waxy quality of death. Vomit stained her red gown, and the muscle rigidity suggested seizures before the end. "I'm sorry, sir," Dr. Flores said gently. "She's gone. We'll transport her to St. Michael's Medical Center, but I need you to understand, there was nothing you could have done." James's collapse was theatrical perfection. He fell against the paramedic, his weight suddenly dead weight, forcing her to catch him. "No, no, no," he moaned. "Not Tina. Not my wife. We were so happy. How does this happen?" The paramedics noticed the shattered wine glass, the elaborate dinner still half-eaten on the table, the anniversary roses wilting in their vase. It looked exactly like what James needed it to look like, a romantic evening destroyed by sudden, inexplicable tragedy. At St. Michael's Medical Center, Tina's body was transported to the morgue while James gave his statement to the attending physician. Dr. Ramon Santos had seen sudden deaths before, young people whose hearts simply stopped for reasons medicine couldn't always explain. "I'm so sorry for your loss, Mr. Mitchell," Dr. Santos said, his hand on James's shoulder. "We'll need to perform an autopsy to determine the cause of death, but from the paramedics' report, it appears cardiac-related. These things are rare in someone so young, but they do happen. Genetic conditions, undiagnosed heart defects." "She was healthy," James interrupted, his voice breaking perfectly. "She had no history of heart problem. We just had physicals 6 months ago. Both of us. Clean bills of health. How is this possible? I don't have answers yet. The autopsy will tell us more." James nodded, allowing himself to be led to a private waiting room where they gave him sedation he pretended to take, palming the pills and hiding them in his pocket. He needed to appear devastated enough to require medication, but he also needed to remain clear-headed for what came next. At 11 p.m., Tina's mother Rosario arrived at the hospital, her face already destroyed by tears before anyone had explained what happened. Her daughter was dead. Her beautiful daughter who'd married well, who'd secured their family's future, who'd smiled less and less over the past 3 years but had at least been safe and provided for and alive. Rosario's screaming echoed through the hospital corridors. Tina's siblings arrived shortly after: Maria, 19, pre-med student; Carlos, 17, engineering track; and little Sophia, 14, still in her school uniform because she'd been studying when the call came. They collapsed together in the waiting room, a knot of grief that had no language, no processing, no comprehension of how healthy 24-year-olds simply died. James embraced them each in turn, his performance never wavering. "She was everything to me," he told Rosario, gripping the older woman's hands. "I don't understand. We were so happy. The dinner, the anniversary. I'll never forgive myself for not seeing the signs." "What signs?" Rosario asked through tears. "She was healthy. I should have noticed something. Anything. I failed her." The family comforted him, their grief complicated by gratitude for everything he'd provided. James had saved them from poverty, had given them security, had treated Tina like a princess. None of them suspected that the man crying in their arms had murdered their daughter just hours before. On March 16th, the autopsy began. Chief Medical Examiner Dr. Patricia Santos had performed thousands of postmortem examinations in her 30-year career, but something about this case felt wrong from the first incision. The victim's organs showed damage inconsistent with cardiac arrest. The liver displayed necrosis, the kidneys showed crystallization, and the stomach lining was severely irritated. She took extensive tissue samples and sent them to the toxicology lab with a priority flag. Her preliminary report noted, "Suspicious toxic substance ingestion. Recommend comprehensive tox screen." The results came back on March 18th. Lethal levels of ethylene glycol detected in blood, tissue, and stomach contents. The concentration indicated recent ingestion, approximately 150 milliliters, administered orally. This wasn't a heart attack. This was murder. Dr. Santos amended her report immediately, changing the manner of death from undetermined to homicide. She contacted the Manila Police Department Homicide Division and requested they open a criminal investigation. Detective Rafael Domingo received the case file at 2 p.m. on March 18th. 42 years old, 20 years with the MPD, specialized in domestic homicides, he'd seen every variation of spouse killing the human mind could devise. Poison was classic, clean, distant, allowing the killer to maintain plausible deniability while watching their victim suffer. The husband was always the first suspect. Statistics, experience, and common sense dictated it. Rafael read Dr. Santos's report, reviewed the initial incident reports from the paramedics, and scheduled an interview with James Mitchell for the following morning. James arrived at police headquarters with his lawyer, attorney Marcus Velasco, one of Manila's most expensive criminal defense attorneys. The fact that he'd retained counsel before being officially named a suspect raised Rafael's suspicions immediately, but wealthy people always lawyered up early. It meant nothing or it meant everything. "Mr. Mitchell, thank you for coming in," Rafael began, his tone neutral. "I'm sorry for your loss. I know this is a difficult time, but we need to ask some questions about the night your wife died." "Of course," James said. his voice hoarse from supposedly crying for 3 days straight. Anything to help understand what happened to Tina. Walk me through the evening. Start from the beginning. James's story was practiced to perfection. He'd cooked dinner himself as a romantic gesture. Their 3rd anniversary deserved something special. They'd eaten together, laughed together, celebrated 3 years of marriage. Tina had seemed fine initially, then complained of dizziness. The collapse happened suddenly, violently, without warning. He'd tried CPR, called 911 immediately, done everything he could. What did you serve for dinner? Raphael asked. Appetizers, lumpia. Main course was tom yum soup and grilled fish. Dessert was supposed to be mango float, but we never got there. Did you both eat the same food? Yes, everything. I cooked it myself from the same pots. The lie came smoothly because James had practiced it 1,000 times. In reality, 2 separate soup pots had existed, but they'd been washed and disposed of before anyone arrived. The poison bowl had been washed and returned to the cabinet, the scratch on its rim invisible unless you knew to look for it. Have you had any marital problems? Arguments? Infidelity? Financial stress? Attorney Velasco interrupted. My client's marriage was stable and loving. These questions seemed designed to implicate rather than investigate. We have to ask, Raphael said calmly. Ethylene glycol poisoning doesn't happen accidentally. Attorney. Someone killed Mrs. Mitchell. I'm trying to determine who and why. James's face performed shock and horror beautifully. You're saying someone murdered her? Who would do that? Tina had no enemies. Everyone loved her. What about you, Mr. Mitchell? Did you love her? More than anything in the world. Check my finances. I provided everything for her family. Her mother, her siblings, all taken care of. I gave Tina the life she deserved. Why would I kill her? It was a good question, one Raphael didn't have an answer for yet. Motive wasn't obvious. James Mitchell was wealthy enough that life insurance wouldn't matter much. There were no obvious affairs, no known conflicts, no apparent reason for murder. Raphael let them leave after 2 hours of questioning, but his instincts screamed that James Mitchell was guilty. The over-rehearsed story, the expensive lawyer, the performance of grief that felt just slightly off, like an actor who'd studied the role but never lived it. But instincts weren't evidence, and Raphael needed evidence. On March 20th, that evidence began arriving in the form of an anonymous phone call to the police hotline. The voice was male, disguised with what sounded like a handkerchief over the receiver, nervous and urgent. You're investigating Celestina Mitchell's death? You should look at Richard Morrison, American retiree, 71 years old. They were having an affair. I saw them together multiple times at Harbor View Inn. He talked about getting money from her. Check his finances. Check his apartment. He killed her, and he's going to get away with it. The call disconnected before the operator could trace it. Victor Cruz, sitting in his car 3 blocks from police headquarters, removed the battery from the burner phone and dropped it in a trash bin. James had paid him an additional 100,000 Cuban pesos to make that call, and Victor's conscience, already compromised by months of surveillance work, accepted the money without much protest. Raphael was initially skeptical. Anonymous tips were unreliable, often driven by grudges or delusions, but the caller had provided specific information, a name, a location, a motive. He ran Richard Morrison through the system and found nothing except an expired tourist visa that had been properly renewed. Clean record in the United States, no criminal history, seemingly just another elderly expat living out retirement in a cheaper country. But the Harbor View in detail was verifiable. Raphael sent officers to interview the hotel staff, and within hours they confirmed that a younger Filipina woman and an elderly American man had rented room 207 regularly over the past several months, always paying cash, always checking in separately. Raphael cross-referenced Richard Morrison with known associates of Celestina Mitchell and found the connection. Sacred Heart Community Church Volunteer Program. They'd worked together, which meant opportunity for an affair. He requested Richard's financial records and found exactly what the anonymous caller had suggested. A 500,000 Cuban pesos deposit on March 1st from an account registered to C. Mitchell. Motive was crystallizing. Affair plus financial entanglement plus access to the victim. Raphael applied for a search warrant for Richard Morrison's residence, and on March 21st at 10 a.m., he knocked on the door of Tranquil Gardens Retirement Community, apartment 4B. Richard Morrison answered in pajamas and reading glasses, holding a cup of coffee, looking every one of his 71 years. His face transformed from mild confusion to absolute horror when Raphael identified himself and explained why he was there. Tina's dead. Richard's coffee cup fell from his hand, shattering on the tile floor. Oh God! Oh my God! How? We're investigating. How did you know her, Mr. Morrison? Church. We volunteered together at Sacred Heart. We were friends. She was unhappy in her marriage. We talked. I cared about her. The words tumbled out, grief and shock making him forget to be cautious. What happened? Please, tell me what happened. She was poisoned. Ethylene glycol. Someone put antifreeze in her food. Richard's legs gave out. He sat heavily on his sofa, his face the color of old paper. Who would do that? Who would hurt her? That's what we're trying to determine. Were you and Mrs. Mitchell having an affair? The honest answer would have been to lawyer up, to say nothing, to protect himself. But Richard Morrison had spent 40 years teaching teenagers that honesty mattered, that truth was sacred, and grief was short-circuiting his survival instincts. Yes, he said simply. I'm not proud of the affair, but I loved her. She was going to leave him. We were going to be together, poor but happy. Did he do this? Did James kill her? Raphael noted the immediate suspicion directed at the husband. Why do you think her husband would kill her? Because he owned her. Because she was finally choosing herself over security. Because men like James Mitchell don't let go of their possessions. Richard was crying now, ugly tears that came from somewhere deep and broken. Please tell me he didn't kill her. Please tell me I didn't get her killed by loving her. But even as Richard spoke, Raphael's team was executing the search warrant, and what they found in apartment 4B would destroy any credibility the old man's grief might have earned him. The laptop was on the kitchen table, password protected but easily bypassed. The emails folder contained correspondence between Richard and Tina that was damning in its specificity. Once James is out of the picture, we can be together. His life insurance will set us up. I can't wait to be free of him, whatever it takes. In the nightstand drawer, they found handwritten letters in Richard's handwriting. My dearest Tina, I promise you, I will find a way to eliminate him. Antifreeze is undetectable if done right. Trust me. A burner phone was discovered in the closet, its text history showing detailed murder planning. March 10th, dinner on the 15th. He won't suspect. Make sure he eats from the right bowl. The bank statement showing the 500,000 Cuban pesos transfer was in a filing cabinet, along with what appeared to be a revised will signed by Celestina Mitchell, leaving 50% of her estate to Richard Morrison. This is insane, Richard kept repeating as officers photographed the evidence. I never wrote these. I don't own a burner phone. That money transfer never happened. This is a setup. You have to believe me. James is framing me. But Detective Rafael Domingo had seen guilty people claim frame-ups 1,000 times. The evidence was overwhelming, methodical, exactly the kind of documentation that proved premeditation. Richard Morrison had motive, opportunity, and apparently the cold-blooded planning necessary to poison a young woman for financial gain. On March 23, 2024, Richard Morrison was arrested and charged with first-degree murder of Celestina Mitchell and conspiracy to commit murder of James Mitchell. The bail was set at 5 million Cuban pesos, an amount Richard couldn't begin to afford on his teacher's pension. He was transported to Manila Central Jail to await trial, protesting his innocence to anyone who would listen, which was precisely no one. The evidence was too perfect, too comprehensive, too damning. James Mitchell, meanwhile, played the devastated widower with Oscar-worthy commitment. He attended Tina's funeral on March 25, delivered a eulogy that made even the priest cry, and collapsed sobbing over her casket while cameras captured every moment. Social media erupted with sympathy. News outlets ran stories about the grieving husband who'd been betrayed and left bereft. I trusted her, James told reporters, his voice breaking. I loved her. Finding out about the affair after her death, it's devastating twice over. But I'm grateful the man responsible will face justice. Tina deserved better than both of us gave her. The life insurance company, reviewing the case, found no red flags. The husband wasn't a suspect. Richard Morrison had been arrested with overwhelming evidence. The 15 million Cuban pesos policy paid out in May 2024, deposited directly into James Mitchell's account. He also filed civil suits against Richard Morrison's estate, claiming wrongful death and seeking restitution. Richard's pension account was frozen. His modest savings of 800,000 Cuban pesos were seized. Everything the old man had accumulated over 40 years of teaching was taken by the man who'd actually committed the murder. In Manila Central Jail, Richard Morrison was dying slowly. The conditions were harsh: overcrowded cells, insufficient medical care, violence from other inmates who considered elderly foreigners easy targets. His minor heart condition, previously well managed with medication, deteriorated rapidly without proper treatment. He told anyone who would listen that James Mitchell had framed him, that the evidence was fabricated, that an innocent woman had been murdered by her husband. But his court-appointed public defender, attorney Lisa Flores, was overworked and under-resourced. She believed in his innocence but lacked the expertise to prove sophisticated evidence fabrication. The trial was scheduled for September 2024. Richard's health declined steadily. In July, he suffered a minor heart attack in his cell. In August, severe depression required psychological evaluation. He kept claiming, "James Mitchell framed me. Please, someone investigate him." But no one was listening. The evidence against Richard Morrison was too strong, and James Mitchell's performance as grieving husband was too convincing. Justice, it seemed, had already been served. The guilty man was in jail. The innocent widower was free to grieve and rebuild. The only problem was that every single part of that narrative was a lie, and Richard Morrison was running out of time to prove it. September 2024. Richard Morrison sat in the prison hospital ward at St. Michael's Medical Center, handcuffed to a bed that smelled like disinfectant and despair. His second heart attack had been massive, the kind that left doctors shaking their heads and using words like "remarkable" that he survived at all. But survival felt less like a gift and more like an extended torture session. "Mr. Morrison, you need to understand," the cardiologist said gently, reviewing charts that told a story of systematic physical collapse. "Your heart isn't going to survive the stress of trial. You have weeks, maybe a month. The conditions in Manila Central Jail are killing you." "Then let me die knowing someone believes me," Richard whispered, his voice barely audible above the monitoring equipment. "James Mitchell murdered his wife and framed me. I didn't kill Tina. I loved her." The doctor nodded with the practiced sympathy of someone who'd heard 1,000 declarations of innocence from guilty men. He didn't believe Richard, but he pitied him. That was something, at least. Father Miguel Santos visited on September 10th, the first visitor Richard had received in weeks. The priest was 73, with silver hair and eyes that had witnessed too much human suffering to be shocked by anything anymore. He'd known Richard for 2 years through volunteer work, had watched him serve meals with genuine kindness, had seen him interact with Tina with a tenderness that seemed incapable of violence. "I didn't do this, Father," Richard said, gripping the priest's hand with surprising strength for someone so close to death. "Tina spoke to me about James. She was terrified of him. He was controlling, paranoid, obsessive. She wanted to leave but was afraid he'd destroy her family financially if she tried." "I believe you," Father Miguel said simply, and the relief that flooded Richard's face was heartbreaking. "But belief isn't evidence, my son. What can I do?" "Investigate him, please. There has to be something, some mistake he made, some evidence that proves the frame. I'm going to die in here, but I can't die with everyone thinking I murdered the woman I loved." Father Miguel left the hospital with a weight pressing against his chest. He'd performed hundreds of last rites, offered comfort to the dying more times than he could count. But something about Richard's plea felt different. The man wasn't asking for forgiveness or peace. He was asking for truth. The priest couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, truth was worth fighting for. On September 14th at 3:47 a.m., Richard Morrison suffered a massive coronary event that no amount of medical intervention could reverse. He was declared dead at 4:12 a.m., still handcuffed to the hospital bed, still branded a murderer in official records, still robbed of the justice he'd spent his final months begging for. The news reported his death with casual dismissal. American retiree dies awaiting trial for murder of young Filipina wife of Australian expat. Victim's family expresses relief that the accused won't face trial, sparing them additional trauma. James Mitchell released a statement through his lawyer. "I'm glad Mr. Morrison won't face trial. Tina wouldn't have wanted more suffering. I hope he found peace, though he took hers from her." The magnanimity was noted by journalists who praised his capacity for forgiveness. Privately, James celebrated with expensive whiskey in his penthouse apartment, toasting his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows. The plan had worked perfectly. Tina was dead. Richard was dead. The life insurance had paid out. Richard's seized assets had transferred to James's accounts. No one suspected the truth, and no one ever would. But Father Miguel couldn't let it rest. On September 20th, using discretionary funds from Sacred Heart Church, he hired Carmen Flores, a 62-year-old retired detective from Manila Police Department who'd left the force after 25 years to pursue cold cases that institutional bureaucracy had abandoned. Her reputation was formidable. She'd solved 12 previously unsolvable murders through meticulous reinvestigation of evidence everyone else had dismissed. Something feels wrong about the Richard Morrison case, Father Miguel told her during their first meeting at a quiet cafe in Makati. I knew both Richard and Celestina. The evidence against him is too convenient, too perfect. I need you to review the case with fresh eyes. Carmen accepted the retainer and spent the next 3 days reading every document, every report, every piece of evidence. What she found triggered professional instincts that had never failed her in a quarter-century of detective work. The evidence against Richard wasn't just perfect, it was too perfect. The emails were too detailed, too incriminating, almost like someone had written them specifically to be discovered by police. The handwriting on the letters was too consistent, lacking the natural variation that comes from genuine handwriting over time. The burner phone's purchase date was suspicious, March 2024, after Tina's death, despite text messages allegedly sent in February. Carmen contacted a digital forensics expert, Dr. Antonio Cruz, who specialized in metadata analysis. She sent him copies of the email files found on Richard's laptop. Dr. Cruz's report came back on October 1st. These files were created in February 2024 and backdated to appear from 2023. The metadata shows manipulation using commercial software designed to alter timestamps. Whoever created these knew what they were doing. One piece of fabricated evidence unraveled the entire frame. Carmen interviewed the bank manager who'd processed the 500,000 Cuban pesos transfer to Richard's account. The manager, nervous and evasive, finally admitted under pressure that the transaction had initially been flagged by their fraud detection system as a potentially false entry. Higher-ups told me to verify it as legitimate, the manager said, sweat beading on his forehead. There was a substantial donation made to our chairman's charity shortly after. 2 million Cuban pesos from James Mitchell. I can't prove connection, but the timing was convenient. Carmen pulled James Mitchell's financial records next, tracing his banking history back 5 years. She found payments to Victor Cruz, Crimson Eye Investigations, totaling 150,000 Cuban pesos in July 2023. She found a single payment of 500,000 Cuban pesos to Marco Delgado, a known document forger, in February 2024. The frame was unraveling, thread by thread. She contacted Margaret Mitchell, James's ex-wife, in Brisbane, Australia. Margaret agreed to a video call, and what she revealed painted a picture of a man capable of exactly this kind of methodical revenge. James tracked my affair for 8 months before confronting me, Margaret said, her face tired on the screen. He documented everything, phone records, credit cards, private investigators. He was obsessed with proof, with building an airtight case. The divorce nearly destroyed me financially because he'd hidden assets I couldn't prove existed. Do you think he's capable of murder? Carmen asked directly. Margaret didn't hesitate. If someone betrayed him? Absolutely. James doesn't forgive. He calculates, he plans, and he destroys. If you're investigating him for Celestina's death, be careful. He's smarter than he appears, and he doesn't leave evidence unless he wants you to find it. Carmen found Victor Cruz next, the private investigator James had hired. Victor initially refused to talk, but when Carmen explained that Richard Morrison had died in jail for a murder he didn't commit, something in the investigator's conscience cracked. They met in Carmen's car on October 15th, parked in an empty lot with the engine running in case they needed to leave quickly. I documented their affair, Victor admitted, his hands shaking. That part was legitimate, but after I delivered the evidence to James, he asked for additional help. He wanted Richard's DNA, coffee cups, trash, anything. I thought it was for divorce leverage. I didn't know he was planning to kill her and frame the old man. Will you testify to that? Victor looked out the window, calculating the risk to his business, his reputation, his freedom. I didn't participate in murder, but I helped build the frame afterward. That makes me an accessory. I could go to prison. Or you could help deliver justice for 2 people who died because of your client's plan. Victor was silent for a long moment, then nodded. I'll testify, but I want immunity. Carmen contacted Marco Delgado next, the document forger. Marco was harder to crack, but the threat of murder accessory charges eventually convinced him to cooperate. He confessed to creating the fake emails, forged letters, and falsified will. James had paid him 500,000 Cuban pesos for work completed in February 2024, weeks before Tina's death, proof of premeditation. With Victor's testimony, Marco's confession, the digital forensics proving backdating, and the bank fraud documentation, Carmen had enough to approach the prosecutor's office. On November 5, 2024, she presented her compiled evidence to District Attorney Rosa Hernandez. The meeting lasted 4 hours, with Carmen methodically dismantling the case against Richard Morrison and building an ironclad case against James Mitchell. This is extraordinary work, DA Hernandez said, reviewing the evidence portfolio. If this is accurate, we convicted an innocent man and let the real killer walk free. Richard Morrison died in jail, branded a murderer, Carmen replied. James Mitchell collected 15 million Cuban pesos in life insurance and seized Richard's assets. We didn't just let him walk free, we rewarded him. The arrest warrant for James Mitchell was issued on November 5, 2024, charging him with first-degree murder of Celestina Mitchell, evidence tampering, fraud, and conspiracy. The charges against Richard Morrison were posthumously vacated. Police arrived at Celestial Heights Tower at 6 a.m. on November 6. James Mitchell answered the door in silk pajamas, his expression transforming from confusion to shock to calculation in the space of 3 seconds. Mr. Mitchell, you're under arrest for the murder of your wife, Celestina Mitchell. His lawyer, attorney Marcus Velasco, was called immediately, but even the most expensive legal defense couldn't overcome the evidence Carmen had compiled. Victor Cruz testified about DNA collection and James's obsessive planning. Marco Delgado testified about the forged documents. Digital forensics experts proved the evidence against Richard had been fabricated. The bank official, granted immunity, testified about the bribe that had legitimized a fraudulent transaction. Dr. Patricia Santos, the medical examiner, testified that Tina's stomach contents showed she alone had consumed the poisoned soup. James's claim that they'd eaten from the same pot was demonstrably false. Margaret Mitchell testified via video link about James's pattern of methodical revenge, his obsessive documentation of betrayal, his capacity for long-term planning driven by wounded pride. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The prosecution built a timeline showing 8 months of planning, from hiring Victor Cruz in July 2023 to executing the murder on March 15, 2024. They proved that every piece of evidence against Richard Morrison had been fabricated. They demonstrated that James Mitchell had motive, betrayal, means, access to poison, and opportunity, private anniversary dinner. The defense argued that Victor and Marco were criminals whose testimony was bought with immunity deals, that the evidence was circumstantial, that James Mitchell was a grieving husband being railroaded by investigators desperate to close a case they'd botched initially. But the jury deliberated for only 9 hours. On April 18, 2025, James Mitchell was found guilty on all charges: first-degree murder of Celestina Mitchell, obstruction of justice through evidence fabrication and framing Richard Morrison, and multiple counts of fraud. Judge Maria Flores sentenced him on May 2, 2025, to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. The 15 million Cuban pesos life insurance payout was ordered returned to Tina's family. The 1.2 million Cuban pesos seized from Richard's estate, plus his pension, was restored to a fund established in Richard Morrison's name for scholarships for elderly volunteers. Mr. Mitchell, Judge Flores said, her voice carrying the weight of moral authority, you didn't just murder your wife, you murdered her trust, her lover's reputation, and justice itself. You orchestrated a plot so cruel that an innocent man died in disgrace, believing the world thought him a killer. You will spend the rest of your life in Manila Central Jail, the same facility where Richard Morrison spent his final days. Perhaps you'll learn what he experienced. Perhaps you'll understand the cruelty of dying alone, branded something you're not. James Mitchell showed no emotion as he was led away in handcuffs. His children, Emma and David, had been contacted about the trial but declined to attend or make statements. His former wife Margaret released a statement I'm relieved he can't hurt anyone else. I'm devastated it took 2 deaths to stop him. Richard Morrison was posthumously exonerated on April 19, 2025. Sacred Heart Church held a memorial service attended by over 200 people who'd known him as kind, gentle, and incapable of the violence he'd been accused of. Father Miguel delivered the eulogy, speaking of how Richard had died seeking truth, and how truth had finally vindicated him, too late to matter to the man himself but perhaps enough to matter to his memory. Carmen Flores established the Morrison Flores Justice Foundation, funded by speaking fees from the case that had made her famous. The foundation investigated potential wrongful convictions, offering free forensic analysis to defendants who couldn't afford proper legal defense. Tina's family used the restored life insurance money to open the Celestina Flores Community Center in Barangay San Isidro, offering free education, job training, and support services to families trapped in poverty. Rosario ran the center until her death in 2028. Her hands finally healed from decades of laundry work, her final years dedicated to ensuring other young women wouldn't feel forced to trade themselves for their family's survival. James Mitchell remains in Manila Central Jail, where he maintains his innocence to anyone who will listen. No one does. He files appeals that are routinely denied. He has no visitors. He exists in the same conditions Richard Morrison experienced, the irony noted by guards who remember the elderly American who died protesting his innocence. The case became famous internationally as an example of how sophisticated frame jobs could deceive even experienced investigators, and how persistence in seeking truth could vindicate the innocent even after death. Law enforcement agencies worldwide now use it as a training case for recognizing fabricated evidence. Father Miguel wrote a book called The Price of Kindness about Richard and Tina's story, donating all proceeds to the scholarship fund. The book became a bestseller in the Philippines, sparking conversations about controlling marriages, the vulnerability of women in transactional relationships, and the necessity of believing victims even when evidence seems overwhelming. In the end, Tina Flores died seeking freedom she never achieved. Richard Morrison died seeking justice he never witnessed. And James Mitchell lives in a cage of his own making, having traded his freedom for revenge that ultimately destroyed him. The only winners were truth and memory, fragile victories but victories nonetheless.